what previous baseline factors predict the initiation and cessation of drug use? It is important to know more about this information. It is important to know what factors are associated so we can better reduce harms associated with use. In order to do this, we need to look at what characteristics are present prior to men starting or stopping drugs. Based on the prevalence, incidence, and risk factors associated with crystal and GHB use at baseline, I'll now present what factors are associated in predicting the initiation and cessation of these two drugs. Really quickly, I'll just go over how we do the analysis for longitudinal data to predict initiation cessation. Look at the initiation and cessation for crystal and GHB, and end with a comparison. Unlike the analysis in the previous session that only used cross-sectional baseline data, the data from this analysis comes from 1 year of follow-up. There are many benefits with the longitudinal data. In the context of drug use among gay men, we can now look at what has changed in our participants' lives, track their patterns of use, and as you will see in this presentation, look at the predictive factors associated with the initiation and cessation. The use of longitudinal data allows for the use of more sophisticated analysis. The statistical analysis used for this presentation is known as a Cox regression for survival analysis. The Cox regression is a method of investigating the effects of several variables upon the time a specific event happens. In the case of this presentation, it's initiation and cessation. Lastly, given that we want to investigate those who started and stopped, the comparison groups will be those who started against those who never used, and those who stopped against those who didn't stop. We do this because we want to find out the differences from those who initially never used, and those who started. I'll start by looking at crystal. Given that we want to look at the predictive factors associated with the initiation, we compare those who initiated against those who didn't. So 58 men have started using crystal in the past year. We want to know what was the difference among these men when comparing them to the 1,000 men who did not start. Or, as I said earlier, those who had a history of crystal use weren't included in this analysis. Same sort of setup I've done for the cross-sectional analysis. We included the baseline characteristics that may later predict initiation. As with my previous talk, these factors were driven by previous research. At the univariate level, we see that those who initiated crystal within 1 year of follow-up had similar significant factors that were associated in my previous talk. So those who are currently using crystal and those who initiated crystal have similar patterns of the ratio and the similar statistical significance at each univariate analysis, at each individual factor. Those who are more socially engaged with other gay men at baseline, remember these are the men that have never used crystal, were over, so that's the comparison group, those who initiated were 2 times as likely to start using crystal than those who initiated crystal. So they were 2 times as likely to start using crystal as those that never started. They were also more likely to be engaged in more sexual activities, and similar with the other presentation, there were no differences in depression and anxiety compared to those who never started. So those who never started and those who started, there was no difference in mental health measures. After running the Cox regression, we see that men who are more socially engaged with other gay men who use crystal have more sexual partners and are HIV positive, were more likely to initiate crystal compared to those who have never started. Again, comparing it back to my last presentation on recent crystal use, those high-risk behaviours that were present among those who were using were also present in the final model of initiation. That is, men who commenced using crystal were also engaged in high-risk behaviours prior to their initiation, and were part of friendship networks of gay men who used crystal. But what this final multivariate model tells us is that the key drivers in gay men's initiation of crystal use are being highly sexually active and having more gay friends who use crystal. These two factors speak to the engagement of intensive sex partying, where party and play sessions, which is the use of drugs for sex, is fairly normalised. And why is being HIV positive a predictive factor? We know from lots of previous research that positive men are also far more likely to participate in these same sexually adventurous networks. Indeed, that is one of the primary factors associated with HIV seroconversion. So this speaks to the ongoing engagement of intensive sex partying friendship networks. I described briefly in my first presentation, I described how fame is used to trigger certain questions based on previous responses. We've looked at a lot of quantitative data to capture changes, reasons. Flux also captures a lot of qualitative data. So on top of them choosing their responses, we also give them the opportunity to write out why they started using crystal. Just to give you, so those who weren't using at baseline and initiated at 1 year follow-up, some of the reasons written were it was available and I wanted a long session. Session was in the context of sex partying. To try something new with a couple of one-off casual sex partners. It was a hookup of scruff. He had it and offered it to me. I accepted, and it became available, and I wanted to use it with friends. There are heaps of reasons why people. I've just selected these at random. Interestingly, the majority of them are. The reasons they ascribe to their use had a lot to do with social influence and for the use of sex. So we looked at what factors are associated with initiation. Now looking at the other end, those who ceased using crystal. I'm comparing about 160 men that were using crystal at baseline and continued to do so, with about 20 men who were using crystal at baseline and stopped using it at follow-up. These numbers are fairly smaller, but somewhat reliable for the analysis. Similar to what I did for initiation, we reverse it and look at baseline factors that are present that predict cessation. Men who stopped were less likely to socially engage with other gay men who use crystal. They scored lower on the measure of sexual sensation seeking. So they scored lower on the measure of sexual sensation seeking. HIV positive men were also less likely to stop, but the numbers involved in that category were quite low, so it may not mean a great deal. Putting the final model of the regression. The key factors don't really change, so those who scored lower on the sexual sensation seeking scale and less socially connected with other gay men who use crystal were more likely to cease using crystal. Not surprisingly, those factors that predict the initiation tend to be reversed for those who cease, but not entirely. They are less socially engaged with those friendship networks, at least relatively so, but their actual sexual behaviours haven't changed that much. Comparing men who continue to use and even those who initiated with those who ceased, it may be that the men who discontinued the use of crystal do so because of their social connections have changed. They become less connected with friendships networks where party and play is the norm. While that is true, we need to remember that it's only relative to the men who are continuing use. They were highly engaged in those networks, and now they are less so. That doesn't mean that they are not. That they are. So their social engagement appears to be changing, and they might be pulling out of these networks to some extent. With more longitudinal data over the coming months, we will be in a better position to describe gay men's trajectories into and out of the social networks, and what this means in terms of changing patterns of drug use and crystal use specifically. Again, those who ceased their crystal use were given the opportunity to write in why they stopped using crystal. Just selected a random handful. There was a change of social circles, haven't felt need to. I have not seen that friend. I don't have time to stay awake for 2 days and feel like crap fetus afterwards. And I really never enjoyed it. No longer feel left out when others indulge. Looking at the first two responses, we clearly see that the reasons for using and the reasons for stopping are based on social engagement. So, similar sort of setup for the initiation and cessation of GHB. And in my early analysis of GHB, so for this analysis, I'm comparing 1,100 men who have never initiated GHB with about 35 men who weren't using at baseline but started using at follow-up. These numbers are much smaller than those that we had available for the cessation of crystal. For the univariate associations with initiation, not surprisingly, and similar to those who initiated crystal, most of the risk behaviours were also present in initiating GHB. Again, these behaviours were present prior to the initiation of GHB. Here I want to highlight that the men who initiated GHB were more socially engaged with other gay men who used drugs and more involved in sex partying. Plugging in the final model for the predictive factors for GHB, we see that men who are more socially engaged with other gay men who use drugs and who have more sex partners were more likely to initiate GHB. Characteristics that were present for the crystal initiation were also present for the initiation of GHB in the final model. Both these drugs are primarily used by gay men to enhance sex, very often in the party and play scene. So the relationship between sexual activity isn't surprising, nor is it surprising that the key factors driving crystal uptake would apply to GHB as well. However, it does seem to reiterate that the findings in Brendan's analysis that GHB use and crystal are fairly closely connected. What did they ascribe to their use of, to their reasons for initiating GHB? Experiences shared with friends and very socially inciting. I have not been introduced to it before. Someone offered it to me. Someone offered me some, and then I started using it on my own. Because the guy I'm now partnering with uses it, and one of the guys I had sex with offered it, and I thought, you only live once. Two things become evident when reading these. The reasons for initiation of GHB center around socializing and sex, and the reasons are very similar to those given in the initiation for crystal. Now turning our attention to cessation, we have approximately 100 men who are using GHB at baseline and continue to do so through follow-up. When comparing them with the 20 men who were using at baseline but ceased at follow-up. Again, similar to those who ceased crystal use, those who scored lower on the sexual sensation seeking scale were more likely to stop using GHB. No other factors were significant, but it is important to interpret this analysis with caution because the numbers were so low. Given that the sexual sensation seeking scale was the only factor significant at a univariate level. It is therefore the only factor that loads in the final model. It is worth noting that even though the other variables are not significant, the direction of their association is the same as for cessation in crystal. That would suggest fairly strongly that the problems with this analysis is just simply that the numbers are too low. This also tells us that we need more data as the study proceeds, and we will be able to make a firmer statement about the cessation of GHB. Reasons why they ascribe to stopping GHB. I had a bad experience in Cinematograph in which I overdosed on GHB given to me by a sexual partner, stranger. I have not been able to locate a dealer. Not a drug I really feel safe using, and I just can't get it in this person's city, only in Sydney when I visit. Interestingly, there weren't many that cited withdrawals from social networks, but more to do with lack of access. So comparing the factors that are associated with the initiation of crystal and GHB and cessation of the two drugs, we see that those men who were more socially engaged with other gay men who used drugs and had more sexual partners are more likely to commence using GHB and crystal. Based on these results, and based on those that I presented earlier, it appears that the high-risk behaviours are present before initiating its use, and they continue alongside the use of these drugs. But what is also very clear is that social engagement is a key driver for the initiation of these drugs. Remembering back to Brendan's talk earlier, how crystal and GHB appear to be linked to each other, these data tend to reinforce that finding. Both drugs appear to be important with intensive sex partying networks. Looking at the common factors driving cessation in these two drugs, we see that those who were less sexually adventurous, and scored lower on the sexual sensation seeking scale, were more likely to stop using both drugs. For crystal users, those who were less socially engaged with other gay men who used crystal were more likely to stop using crystal. The patterns for GHB is similar, but the numbers are too small to be reliable. But as this study progresses, again, we'll be able to see these patterns that emerge. In terms of cessation for the use of these two drugs, while there may have been some shift out of their particular social networks of friends who also use drugs, there was no evidence of substantial changes in their sexual behaviours. So at least for some men, changes in the use of their particular drug isn't necessarily connected to sexual behaviour, just their friendship networks, which speaks strongly to the role of normalisation. And it also appears that it also appears to be what matters most in terms of the initiation of these drugs. Yes, sexually adventurous behaviours appear to accompany the uptake of these drugs, but it's the social connection with these friendship networks that really seems to be the driving factor. Those who initiated crystal and GHB were more likely to engage with men who used crystal or drugs and were more sexually adventurous overall compared to those who never initiated. Those who stopped using these drugs may be becoming somewhat less socially engaged with other gay men who use drugs, and they also scored relatively lower on the sexual sensation seeking scale than those men who continued to use. Based on the analysis and on what I presented in my previous session, we can see that social engagement with gay men who use drugs plays an important role in predicting the initiation and cessation of the use of these two drugs. These findings strongly support the connotation that peer norms and the role of social normalisation of drug use within the gay community networks is a key factor in understanding the patterns of drug use among gay and bisexual men. Being immersed in friendship networks of gay men who use drugs speaks very strongly to the role of peer norms. Their own decision about their use of these drugs clearly Their own decision about their use of these drugs clearly reflects what they see among their friends and what is acceptable, preferred, and what is not. So what we need to be able to do is get a better understanding of those kinds of attitudes and beliefs about drug use within these men's friendship networks. Garrett will shortly be speaking about peer norms and attitudes, beliefs shortly after this. And if we actually think back to Brendan's analysis again, drug-using networks can usefully be deployed to look at how these normative beliefs play out within these particular networks. Thanks.